Hi everyone, thanks for joining me for another video. Today I'm going to be looking at my top 20 Britpop albums. So the Britpop movement of the 1990s, you can make your own mind up about when it started and when it finished and what bands were included and what bands weren't. But this is my opinion of the albums that I thought were the top 20 from that period. And there's a couple of things that might not be here and I'll explain why as we go along. Okay, so let's crack straight on. At number 20. I've got Three Piece Suite by Dodgy. Now, I think Dodgy were a really good band of the time. I often think of them as being like the ELO of the Britpop era, just with the productions and the harmonies and such like. You could make a case for their album before this, Homegrown, being a better album, potentially, with some songs like Staying Out for the Summer, Let Me Go Far, and Grassman, etc. But I think just overall, in terms of how it captured the mood of the times, I think this was the album that probably stands out the most. So number 20, Dodgy, Three Piece Suite. At number 19, a great band that often get overlooked, I think, for that period, and that's the Blue Tones. This was their debut album, Expecting to Fly. A really great band, and look beyond Slight Return. Slight Return was a great song, but there was so much more to the Blue Tones than that. Songs on here such as Cut Some Rug, Talking to Clary, Blue Tonic, really, really great songs. And they probably carried on making great songs for longer than almost any other Britpop band. So if you're not familiar with that, certainly check out the Blue Tones. Really good album. That's my number 19. At number 18. Now, is this the best album? I don't know, but if we're looking purely at the sort of Britpop era, this is probably my favourite in that period, and it's Telling Stories by the Charlatans. So, yeah, they made Us and Us Only, which came after this, probably after Britpop finished, and some of their earlier albums, you could argue, were before it started, but this was sort of right in the thick of it. And songs like North Country Boy, One to Another, How High, some absolutely cracking tunes from that period on this album. So that is my number 18. Number 17, possibly the biggest album of the whole period, but it just wasn't as good as everybody thought it was going to be, and that's Oasis, Be Here Now, their third album. Absolutely massive event when this album came out. Probably one of the biggest musical events I can remember happening in my lifetime. But then I think it sort of dawned on everybody that it was just a bit too big, a bit too overblown. I appreciate some people love this album and fair play, but I think there was a lot better stuff done during the period, certainly without the fanfare that this album got. But it's certainly very it certainly tells you a lot about the times that were going on in the mid-1990s. Be Here Now by Oasis. At number 16, His and Hers by Pulp. So Pulp had been around, I think at this point, they'd been around about 15 years and had done very little that had got them any attention. But by the time this came out, with songs the quality of Do You Remember the First Time, She's a Lady, and probably one of my top 10 songs of all time, Babies, is on this album. This catapulted them on to becoming one of the greats of the era. Some cracking songs on there, and great that they started to get the attention that they deserved by the time that this came out. That's His and Hers. At number 15, this is a superb album. I really love this. It's All Change by Cast. I know Cast don't always get seen as one of the sort of big hitters of the period, but looking at some of the songs that are on here, All Right, Sandstorm, Fine Time, History. History is a sensational song. It's just packed with great songs from start to finish. The second album, Mother Nature Calls, was really good as well, but I just think that this had a bit more energy to it that captured the time, so that's why I've included this one in my top 20. But that's a really good album. That's All Change by Cast. Okay, we're now at number 14, and we have got Blur, The Great Escape. So this was probably their biggest album. This came out right at the peak of Britpop in the middle of 1995. They had that fantastic chart battle with Oasis, and Country House, the song that generated that chart battle, of course, is on this album. And Charmless Man, that's just a brilliant energy to that song, fantastic. And you've got things like Stereotypes is great, and The Universal, of course, which just continues to get used in all sorts of things on TV to this day. Brilliant song. Not their best album, in my opinion, as we shall see soon, but certainly a very important album of the times. Worth saying at this point that I think over the last couple of years, I certainly have been thinking about this kind of music a lot more, again just recently, because I'm a guitarist in a band called 90s Music Experience, and we do a lot of this stuff in our set, so it's really got me sort of thinking again about all those great tunes from the time, and what a time it was. Another great band from the era, Supergrass. This is their second album, In It For The Money, that I've got at number 13. So it was a lot more mature than the debut album, but still absolutely packed with great songs like In It For The Money, Richard III, Sun Hits The Sky, etc. It's probably one of my favourite albums of 1997, I think this was. Yeah, really good album. That's my number 13. At number 12, this is a man who sort of became known as the mod father at the time, Paul Weller, Stanley Road. Gets off to a fantastic start with The Changing Man, and then it's really a great 3-song intro. Changing Man, Porcelain Gods, Walk on Gilded Splinters. Really strong opening to this album. And songs like You Do Something to Me, Broken Stones, and Whirlpool's End, which is a bit of a sort of an epic towards the end. This was an album, I think, that inspired a lot of people who were big at the time, because it was sort of a big comeback. Paul Weller had been getting big again over the previous couple of years, and this was probably the peak of that comeback. Just a fantastic album, Stanley Road. And number 11, Ocean Colour Scene, the much maligned Ocean Colour Scene, Moseley Shoals. So it's not their debut album. They did make an album a few years before this, which actually to this day I've still never heard. I'm going to have to put that right at some point. But this album, I listened to it again just recently, and it's just quality from start to finish. It really is. Just great musicianship, great singing, great guitar playing all the way through. And I know that it gets lumped under that term dad rock a little bit, along with Mr. Weller sometimes, but I think that's just a great album. That's Moseley Shoals at number 11. Okay, into the top 10 now. At number 10, I've gone with the debut album of Kula Shaker, K. Now, I could potentially say that I like the follow-up, Peasants, Pigs and Astronauts, more as an album, maybe. But too late for Britpop, can't be included here. But certainly in terms of the tunes, when you've got things like Hey Dude, Govinda, Tatva, Grateful When You're Dead, they are just fantastic rock songs. Crispian Mills is probably the person that I've seen live more than anybody else. When I tot up all the times I've seen Kula Shaker and his other band, the Jeevers, and I did actually see a Crispy Mills solo gig as well once. He's a fantastic performer. This was a great album by them. Very much of its time, the Indian influences all over this album, but it's a lot of fun, and that's my number 10. Okay, at number 9, we saw the second album earlier, but this is their debut, Supergrass, I Should Coco. The thing for me with this album is, considering how young they were at the time, I don't know exactly how young they were, but they must have been probably late teens, they maybe hit the 20s, I'm not quite sure. There's just so much confidence in this as a debut album, incredible. Songs like Caught by the Fuzz and All Right, Man-Sized Rooster. And I really love Sofa of My Lethargy towards the end of this album. Just a really mature song for how young they were at the time. But it's a great document of the middle of the 90s, and that's my number 9, Supergrass. I just do want to say, I mentioned earlier on about things that may or may not be Britpop. One of my absolute favourite albums of all time was released right in the middle of this period, and that's the Benz by Radiohead. But I'm not including that in this poll because I think to class Radiohead as Britpop is a bit of a stretch. So I'm going to leave them out there, but I just wanted to mention the Benz as one of my favourite albums of all time because it happened to be from this period. But anyway, I digress. At number 8, it's another album by Blur. It is Modern Life is Rubbish. Now, there's certainly an argument to say that this is the album that kicked off Britpop. There's another one coming soon that's probably got an even stronger claim in my opinion, but I know a lot of people think that this is sort of right at the start of Britpop. And certainly I think there's the story about how Blur were making this album and they felt that they needed to make it more English to sort of have their own identity on it, and that kind of attitude certainly helped the Britpop movement to flourish. But things like For Tomorrow and Star-Shaped, Chemical World, etc. Just great songs by a band that were really starting to find their feet. And it's a really good album. If you've not heard that for a while, it's definitely worth going back and checking out again. Okay, where are we up to now? We're up to number 7. It's them again. It's Blur, Parklife. Now, this was the follow-up to Modern Life is Rubbish, so the whole Britpop thing was certainly building and starting to certainly become a known thing with the public. But just look at songs that are on here. Girls and Boys, End of a Century, Parklife, Bad Head, To the End. Just This Is a Low, let's not forget that. That's what an awesome song that is as well. Just some great songs throughout. And I think the Britpop movement wouldn't have been what it was without something like Parklife in the mix. Fantastic album. That's my number 7. At number 6, this is one of those. Are they Britpop or aren't they? Well, I think it's certainly in the scene. I get that you could class this as being separate from Britpop, but it's Manic Street Preachers, Everything Must Go. And I think that James Dean Bradfield has been in interviews saying that he actually doesn't mind being associated with the Britpop scene. Fairly recent interview where I think I heard him say that. This is an album that I come back to time and time again because it is just quality all the way through. Elvis Impersonator, Blackpool Pier at the start is it's good, it's funny, it's trying to paint quite a bleak picture of British seaside holidaymaker life, but it's a great song. Designed for Life, just one of the great songs of the whole era. And Kevin Carter, Enola Alone, Everything Must Go, Australia, Small Black Flowers That Grow in the Sky, just brilliant, brilliant songs all the way through. So that's Manic Street Preachers, Everything Must Go. Okay, we're into the top 5 now. It's them again. This is my favourite album by Blur, and it's upside down. It's their self-titled album from 1997. This, to me, is the most complete Blur album. Although Blur had fantastic songs and great albums, there was always bits in albums that just thought, oh, God, I could have done without this. But this album, for me, doesn't have any of that. It's their most consistently strong album all the way through, in my opinion. When Beetlebum came out, I remember in very early 1997, when that started getting radio play, it was very different. It was clear that we were entering a kind of a new phase in this Britpop movement that had been going for about sort of 4 years at the time. Everything was just starting to come down a bit from the joy and the high and the fun that we'd have over the previous few years. Song 2 sounded a bit more as though they'd taken their American influences, the grunge influences, and packed them into 1 minute 59 seconds of brilliance. But songs like MOR, On Your Own, Country Sad Ballad Man, I'm Just a Killer for Your Love, just really good all the way through. This to me is their best album, and I'm happy to have that in my top 5. At number 4, I mentioned Modern Life is Rubbish could be the album that you could consider start of Britpop. For me, this is the start of Britpop, and that is Suede's debut album. So I remember in 1993 when I bought this CD and I listened to this for the first time, I did think to myself, this is different, something's happening. It felt like the start of something, and it's just a sensational album really from start to finish. So Young, Animal Nitrate, Pantomime Horse, The Drowners, Sleeping Pills, Metal Mickey, Animal Lover, and The Next Life, that sort of beautiful ballad at the end of the song. ballad. Is it a ballad? That's probably the wrong word, but there we go. Stunning album. That to me is the start of Britpop, and it is well worth its place in my top 5. And if anybody regards it as their favourite Britpop album, then fair play to you. I can't really argue with that. Okay, we're into the top 3. Second appearance. I was just thinking then for a second, by the big boys, Oasis. Their debut album, definitely maybe. Just, if ever a hurricane is going to come along and sweep away everything before it and announce itself as the new big thing, that's an album that's going to do it. In the same way that the Sex Pistols had about 18 years earlier, roughly 17 years earlier. Rock and Roll Star, Shaker Maker, Live Forever, Columbia, Supersonic, Cigarettes and Alcohol, Slide Away, just absolute classics on this album. And it was clear that they were going to be a force as soon as this came along. To me, I very much sort of tie this in as being... I got to know about this about the same time as I got to know about Parklife, so that's sort of where I entered the picture in terms of me being a fan of Britpop. And just... yeah, fantastic album, fantastic. One of the great debut albums of all time, I would contend. An idea for another video there sometime. Greatest debut albums of all time. Might have to think about that one. That will certainly feature. Okay, top 2. It's them again. It's Oasis. What's the Story? Morning Glory. So I said earlier that Be Here Now was probably the biggest event in terms of the hype around its release. But in terms of how big something could be because of people's reaction to it once it was released, it's this. What's the Story? Morning Glory. For some of you watching will be in the UK, and know there's quite a few people in the US who watch my videos who maybe don't know so much about how much Oasis just owned the mid-90s in the UK. They were everywhere. It's the nearest thing I've ever seen to what it could have been like in the 60s with the Stones, the Beatles. I'm sure it wasn't like overall what the Beatles were in the 60s, but certainly the influence that the likes of the Stones maybe had. They were everywhere in popular culture. They affected how young British men dressed, how they talked, how they acted. It was just everywhere. The songs on this roll with it. Wonderwall, Don't Look Back in Anger, Some Might Say, She's Electric, Champagne Supernova. These songs write the story of the 90s in the UK. And it's just a stunning album. You could argue that that's a better album, and if you want to argue that, then it's a fair shout, absolutely, because they're both classics. But in terms of the impact and the effect that it's had on popular culture, you're not going to beat that. That's my number 2. It's my number 2. I'm ranking something ahead of it. Well, okay, if we're talking purely as a musical statement, what is my number 1 Britpop album? It is Different Class by Pulp. Time has probably helped me to appreciate just how great this album is. I knew it was fantastic the moment I bought it in 1995 and listened to it for the first time, but it just gets better and better. Common People, especially the album version, is another Pulp song that is absolutely my top 10 songs of all time, along with Babies. And again, it's just a fantastic album all the way through, with Misshapes, Pencil Skirt, Common People, I Spy. That is such an intense song, is I Spy. If you don't know I Spy, that is intense, well worth listening to. Disco 2000, fantastic. Something Changed, Sorted, Freeze and Whiz, Underwear. Just a brilliant, brilliant album all the way through. And these 2 albums came out within a very short space of each other. I don't think there was much more than about a month or so in it. And this was the peak. Everything that came before had been building up to this moment. Everything that came after, while some of it was still great, was a bit of a come down. This is the peak. That's why I've got those as my top 2. And yeah, that is my top 20 Britpop albums. Thank you for watching. Hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll hopefully see you again for another video soon. Thank you very much. Bye bye.